Today I'm cautiously wading into the mind of Aldous Huxley and reviewing with my 5 likes and 5 dislikes his provocative novel, Brave New World. While I'm trying to keep in mind those who may have stopped by to pick up book report ideas, I'm going to keep the synopsis part of this short and sweet with the assumption that everybody here has probably already read the book. This book is Huxley's fantasy or prediction of how the world might look in the future. In this imagined dystopia, the world values happiness, consumption, social stability, and contentment over all else. Humans are grown in labs and hatcheries and conditioned to think and act in certain ways, generally emotionless, and are bred into castes. Individuality doesn't exist. Everyone belongs to everyone else. Emotional response is addressed both by the initial genetic, chemical, and hormonal manipulation and behavioral conditioning, and later, more acutely, the use of psychotropic drugs called soma. Early in the story, we follow Bernard Marx. He's an alpha, and he's one of the few who's not quite content with this stay-in-your-lane society. He travels with his love interest Lenina to a savage reservation where they witness a more base or uncivilized way of living. They meet John the Savage at this reservation, and they invite him to experience their brave new world. The experiment is less than successful, and John rages against promiscuity, the absence of art and religion, and the propensity of soma. He quickly devolves, and his story ends with suicide. Huxley's work is satire, exaggerating elements of society he finds ridiculous, or dangerous, or threatening. Big government, overbearing and inflated institutions, eugenics, and sexual inhibition. Huxley's goal is to open people's minds to this. There was an interview that I watched where Huxley is talking to Mike Wallace years after this book was written and published, and Huxley's discussing the 2 main threats or elements that push us towards a brave new world. One being overpopulation, this leading to interventionist and totalitarian government because resources can't meet demand, and therefore the state steps in and wields greater power than it should. The second being the ability to mass organize. Ford's the representation of that in the book. I'll put a link to the interview. It's a really interesting watch. Huxley's fantasy, a warning that it's still today and always relevant, makes this book fit to be read. So here's my 5 likes and 5 dislikes for Brave New World. Like number 1, the condemnation of the controlling or conditioning state, or really any institution. The satire, and how it perhaps ambiguously implicates more than only the obvious. Meaning we see the condemnation of this dystopian Brave New World, but the satire finds more than just that in its crosshairs. Warnings abound lest we find ourselves in a situation we didn't foresee. Technology misuse, advancing as a tool for suppression, is called out. Technology is not being called evil, it's rather neutral, but the danger is in how the state or institutions can use it as a tool. The purpose of the book is not the plot. The purpose is the examination of society, the price of utopia, the contemplation of freedom, technology, mores, morals. It is to warn against the complacency and ignorance of who has the power and how that power is wielded, with a threat of an end result that finds us as a society happy in our slavery. Like number 2 is the confused notion of John the Savage as hero. The head fake on this, by chapter 13, I'm curious to see if John turns out to be a device in the story that reveals how ludicrous everything else is, and if he's the sane and pragmatic hero of the story. He's far from being the hero. Were we not being led to expect that his love of Shakespeare and art and struggle and chivalry would be a more virtuous contrast to the immoral, convenient, unimaginative, and restrictive Brave New World? It really starts to unravel with his courtship of Lenina. She is throwing herself at him, and he is incoherent and mumbling and talking about bringing her the skin of a lion to prove his worth. He offers to sweep the floors to prove himself to this woman who has not provided any substance to engender such a devotion or an obsession. But somehow he is smitten with her. It really reminds me of the book The Far Pavilions, when Ashok, the protagonist, is pursuing Belinda, a woman who is just not worthy of his affections. And though we expect him to be more enlightened and discerning, maybe just because he's the protagonist and we have that high view of him, it just works in that book because it just reveals to us that he is young and naive, and we shouldn't expect him to be perfect, especially not in a world of love and courtship. Savage, who is seemingly the antithesis of the stupid people in this story, is croning on about not being worthy of the vapid Lenina. Clearly there's some psychosis that's just not being talked about here. Him not being loved enough by Linda, his mother, who raised him on the Savage reservation. The attraction to Lenina being some sort of transference, thus avoiding any need for Lenina to be substantive to be worthy of his love. The point is, though, we get pulled away from any illusion we might have had that the story was going to use John to present to us the example of what the world should look like. He's just as flawed as all of the other characters, if not more so. The world he comes from has its own institutions abusing the power of controlling the herd to think and behave one way, with one universal set of values. Like number 3 is the humor. The book is not humorous. There are no like laugh out loud, haha moments. It is serious with a lot of intentional absurdity. But because it's serious and dry, and even lacking big exciting moments, the smallest and most subtle instances of dry humor can really stand out. I'm thinking of chapter 13. It begins with Lenina at work. She's inoculating embryos for sleeping sickness. She's forlorn about John the Savage. She's frustrated with Henry Foster, who she's talking to. He won't leave her alone. And she just finally snaps at him. She forgets if she gave one of the embryos the injection, and she decides to not give him take a chance of giving him a second one so it just doesn't inoculate one of the embryos. Well, in the very next line we read, 22 years, 8 months, and 4 days later, a promising young alpha minus was to die of trypanosomiasis. Whatever that is. I guess it's a sleeping sickness. There are a few of those dark humorous moments, and they stand out in the otherwise antiseptic landscape of the story. Dislike number 1, Bernard returns from the reservation aware that the director is going to humiliate him and transfer him to Iceland. He's just going to humiliate him in front of everybody. He knows he's looking for it. After the director calls him out in front of everyone, Bernard drops the bomb that the director has a son. So, of course, the director is embarrassed. A little bit of a surprise, he resigns. It's that embarrassing. This is a little bit of raw meat for us, and it's a delicious treat at that. It is also a bit of a tease, and definitely too short-lived. We wanted to see this guy handed his hat, and we were a little bit robbed of that payoff. Dislike number 2. Other than the director, no one else seems to get any comeuppance whatsoever. As a thought piece, this is obviously irrelevant, but as a story, it's another characteristic of its mediocrity. Like number 4, Bernard's character feels more real once we see him bringing John the Savage into the brave new world. He becomes a cocky, pompous little twit. This doesn't replace his previous outcast nature and his skepticism. It just adds more layer and complexity to his character. Dislike number 3, Bernard is abandoned somewhat as a focus of the story, and we don't get to see more of that previously promising character growth. I think he just became maybe an inconvenience to the direction that the story was going, and therefore he was neglected. Dislike number 4, BNW is super boring. The storytelling, pulling double duty of trying to tell a story while also offering a warning of sorts, it just falls short on the side of delivering a riveting narrative. You can look at a novel like Atlas Shrugged. Ignore Ayn Rand's motivation and take away any social or political philosophy, and it still stands on its own as a very entertaining and a hard-to-put-down read. Huxley's warnings, I believe, are more consequential and really deserving of our energy and attention, but the story is really predictable and it's really flat. Like number 5, sticking with Atlas Shrugged comparisons, which is interesting because I think 1984 is always the book you're going to hear about when you're talking about Brave New World. Anyway, I'm sticking with Atlas Shrugged. I love when some of the minor villains are just written as detestable with no redeeming values. The villains are villains in every way. No time is spent making them deeper by showing they have a decent side or complexity. Wesley Mooch in Atlas Shrugged. He's just one really good example of this. He's just like sniveling exaggeration of a detestable person. Even his name, Mooch, it sounds slimy. Wesley, it sounds like weasel. Huxley unapologetically gives Fanny the same treatment. She is just the worst. I picture this debutante spoiled doofus who is one inconvenience away from asking to speak to the manager. Generally in a novel, I prefer rich characters, but there are types of these propaganda books where the world of the book is enriched with characters where we see only that one dominant trait or level, and we know exactly where we stand with them. This is not really a serious topic that comes up when discussing Brave New World, but can we just all agree that Fanny is the worst? Dislike number 5. As much foresight into the future world that Huxley proposes, even he cannot escape that he is a product, in some ways, of his environment. And he's conditioned to some degree by the time he lives in. The book is genius in challenging the reader to digest the contrast of the virtue and flaws of the Brave New World and the world and religion that John Savage was raised in. Huxley enlists imaginary drugs, the imaginary drug soma, religion, promiscuity versus monogamy, genetic manipulation, etc., 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 as device tools to titillate us with examples of profound virtue or profound immorality or evil. Except maybe in the case of religion, which is that could just be another example of an institution that's ambiguous in that it's presented at times as virtuous and at other times a potential additional institution for conditioning without questioning. But back to the dislike, it appears Huxley has his list of good things and his list of shockingly bad or offensive things. I contend his list is designed not only by his unique elevated social perspective or philosophy, but it's also influenced by the fact that he exists in 1930 and is a product of his time to some degree. One example is the promiscuity that's reveled at in Brave New World. We, the readers, I believe, are expected to be aghast at sexual liberation, free-willing libidos, and the disdain for monogamy, the promotion of sex. In 2020, clearly there are those who are still aghast by such things, but for many, sexual liberation is seen as a great advancement in our culture. We have new and more inclusive definitions of family, and people are more conscientious and unlikely to shame others on the basis of prolific sexuality. So I think that's a little bit of a miss there for me. But those are my 5 likes and my 5 dislikes. This book, no doubt, can inspire a lot of conversation and debate. I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments below, whether it be about the storytelling, or the philosophy and ideas, or both or all of that, or something else altogether. While I'm off to read more books, I will appreciate it if you please like this video, click the subscribe button, ring the notification bell. Thank you.